Venezuela's submarine: how a single patrol nearly ignited a global crisis. Let me take you back to the evening of March 12, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another routine escalation in the long, grinding standoff between Venezuela and Guyana. The Venezuelan Navy announced it had detected and intercepted a Guyanese-flagged seismic survey vessel, the Ramform Tethys, operating in disputed waters off the Essequibo coast. Caracas claimed the ship was conducting illegal oil exploration in territory it insists belongs to Venezuela under a 19th-century arbitral award. The vessel, they said, was escorted out of the area by a Venezuelan submarine, the Sabalo, a diesel-electric boat acquired from Russia in the early 2010s. The incident barely made headlines in the Western press. A few wire reports, a stern statement from the U.S. Southern Command, and then, silence. Business as usual in the Caribbean. But here's that submarine patrol wasn't just another flex in Venezuela's long-running territorial dispute. It was a calculated provocation, one that nearly triggered a direct military confrontation between the United States and Russia, with China waiting in the wings. And if you think that's an exaggeration, you haven't been paying attention to the way great powers now operate in the gray zone between peace and war. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of Latin American politics, great power competition, and military brinkmanship. I've advised governments, briefed intelligence committees, and written extensively on how seemingly minor incidents, like a single submarine surfacing in disputed waters, can spiral into something far more dangerous. And what I can tell you is the Sabalo incident was not an isolated event. It was a test. A probe. A move in a much larger game, one where the rules are being rewritten in real time, and where the stakes aren't just about oil or territory, but about the future of American hegemony itself. So let's start with the official story, the one you've probably heard, if you've heard anything at all. The official: a routine dispute, nothing to see here. According to the version of events that dominated Western media, this was just another flare-up in the decades-old Essequibo dispute. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has long claimed the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory rich in oil, gold, and timber, as its own, despite an 1899 arbitral award that granted it to British Guiana. In 2018, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the area, and since then, Guyana has been rapidly developing them with the backing of Western energy firms. Venezuela, facing economic collapse and international isolation, has responded with a mix of nationalist rhetoric and military posturing. The Ramform Tethys incident fit neatly into this pattern. The Venezuelan government released a statement accusing Guyana of provocative actions in violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. The U.S. Southern Command, which has been conducting joint military exercises with Guyana since 2020, issued a carefully worded "We are monitoring the situation closely and urge all parties to avoid escalation." The British government, which still maintains a military presence in Guyana, dispatched a Royal Navy patrol vessel to the region as a show of support. The UN Security Council held a closed-door session, but no formal statement was issued. Case closed, right? The media narrative was equally straightforward. Reuters ran a piece titled "Venezuela Escorts Guyanese Survey Ship from Disputed Waters," framing it as a minor incident with no broader implications. The New York Times buried the story in its international section, treating it as a local dispute with no geopolitical significance. Even the more hawkish outlets, like the Washington Post, downplayed the submarine's role, focusing instead on Venezuela's desperate attempts to distract from its domestic crisis. But there's a problem with this narrative. Actually, there are several. First, the Sabalo wasn't just any submarine. It was one of the most advanced diesel-electric boats in the region, capable of operating silently for weeks at a time. More importantly, it was part of a fleet that Russia has been quietly modernizing for Venezuela over the past decade, a fleet that includes Kilo-class submarines, Su-30 fighter jets, and S-300 air defense systems. These aren't the tools of a country merely making a symbolic protest. These are the tools of a country preparing for a real fight. Second, the timing was suspiciously convenient. The incident occurred just days after the U.S. announced it was sending the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group to the Caribbean for routine exercises. The George Washington isn't just any ship, it's a floating airbase, capable of projecting power across the entire region. Its presence was a clear message to "don't push your luck."
And yet, Venezuela pushed anyway. Third, and most telling, the ramform Tethys wasn't just any survey vessel.
It was owned by PGS, a Norwegian company, but it was operating under contract for ExxonMobil, one of the most politically connected corporations in the world. Exxon has deep ties to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and its operations in Guyana have been explicitly framed as part of America's broader strategy to counter Chinese and Russian influence in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, this wasn't just a commercial dispute. It was a proxy conflict. So why did Venezuela risk a direct confrontation with the U.S. over a single ship? And why did they use a submarine, a weapon that, in naval warfare, is the ultimate escalation tool, to do it? The answer, as always, lies in what wasn't being said. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the submarine itself. The Sabalo is a Project 636.3 kilo-class submarine, a design that Russia has been exporting to its allies for decades. These boats are notoriously difficult to detect, and they're armed with Club S cruise missiles capable of striking targets up to 300 kilometers away.
In the hands of a competent crew, a kilo-class submarine is a nightmare for any surface fleet. Now, here's the part the media didn't. Venezuela's submarine force is not just for show.
In 2022, Russian naval technicians were spotted in Venezuela conducting maintenance on the Sabalo and its sister ship, the Caribe. Satellite imagery from that period shows increased activity at the Puerto Cabello naval base, including the presence of Russian advisors. And in 2023, Venezuela conducted its first-ever live-fire submarine exercises in the Caribbean, testing its ability to operate in contested waters.
This wasn't just posturing. This was preparation. But why now? Why risk a direct confrontation with the U.S. over a single survey ship? The answer lies in two: multipolarity and desperation. Venezuela's economy is in freefall.
Hyperinflation, sanctions, and mismanagement have reduced the country to a shadow of its former self.
Maduro's government is clinging to power through a combination of repression and patronage, but its legitimacy is paper-thin. The only thing keeping him in office is the support of the military, and even that is fraying. In 2023, there were at least 3 attempted coups against Maduro, all of them involving mid-ranking officers. The regime is fragile, and it knows it. So what do you do when you're a weak government facing an existential crisis? You create an external enemy.
You manufacture a crisis to rally your base. And if you're really clever, you use that crisis to extract concessions from the great powers.
Here's where it gets interesting.
In the weeks leading up to the ramform Tethys incident, there were a series of quiet, back-channel negotiations between Venezuela and Russia. According to sources in the Russian Foreign Ministry, Moscow was pushing Caracas to take a harder line on Essequibo, not because Russia cares about the territory, but because it wants to force the U.S. to divert resources to the Caribbean. The logic is if the U.S. is bogged down in a potential conflict with Venezuela, it has fewer assets to deploy against Russia in Ukraine or China in the South China Sea.
But Russia wasn't the only player in the room.
China, which has been steadily increasing its economic footprint in Venezuela, also had a stake in the game. Beijing has invested billions in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and it sees the country as a critical node in its Belt and Road Initiative. A U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would threaten those investments, and China can't afford to let that happen. So what we had was a perfect to desperate Venezuelan regime, a Russia looking to open a second front against the U.S., and a China eager to protect its economic interests.
The Sabalo incident wasn't just about Essequibo.
It was about testing America's resolve.
It was about seeing how far the U.S. would go to defend its sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And the U.S. response? Well, that's where things get really complicated.
The geopolitical how Venezuela became a proxy battlefield. To understand why this incident nearly spiraled into a major crisis, you have to step back and look at the bigger picture. The world is in the midst of a fundamental power shift, one that's been building for decades but has accelerated dramatically since the Ukraine war. The unipolar moment, where the US was the sole superpower, is over. What we're seeing now is the emergence of a multipolar order, where power is distributed among multiple Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and to a lesser extent, Brussels, Delhi, and Ankara. For the US, this is an existential challenge. American grand strategy since the end of the Cold War has been built on the assumption of unchallenged global dominance. The US doesn't just want to be a great power, it wants to be the great power, the indispensable nation, the guarantor of global order. And for a long time, that worked. The US could invade Iraq, bomb Libya, and impose sanctions on half the world without facing serious pushback. But those days are over.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the first major crack in the unipolar order. It forced the US to confront the reality that its adversaries are no longer willing to play by its rules. China's rise in the Indo-Pacific has been even more destabilizing.
And now, with the Middle East in flames and Europe distracted by its own internal divisions, the US is stretched thinner than at any point since the 1930s.
This is the context in which Venezuela's submarine patrol must be understood.
For Russia and China, Venezuela isn't just a client state, it's a pressure-pay way to force the US to make hard choices.
Do you send troops to Caracas when you're already committed to Kiev and Taipei? Do you risk a direct confrontation with Russia in the Caribbean when you're trying to deter China in the South China Sea? The answer, from Moscow and Beijing's perspective, is no.
And that's exactly what they were testing with the Sabalo incident.
Let me be, this wasn't some half-baked conspiracy.
It was a calculated move, one that fits into a broader pattern of great power competition in the 21st century. We've seen it before in Syria, where Russia and the US nearly came to blows over a single airstrike, in the South China Sea, where Chinese and American warships play a dangerous game of chicken, and in Ukraine, where every escalation carries the risk of direct conflict between nuclear-armed states.
The difference this time is that the US is no longer the only player with the ability to project power globally.
Russia has rebuilt its military, China is rapidly exiting its navy, and both countries are willing to take risks that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this, the military implications. The military, why this could have gone very wrong. When the Sabalo surfaced near the Ramform Tethys, it wasn't just a symbolic gesture.
It was a direct challenge to US naval dominance in the Caribbean.
And the US response was immediate and revealing. Within hours of the incident, the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which had been conducting exercises off the coast of Colombia, altered its course and began moving toward the Essequibo region. At the same time, the U.S. Air Force deployed a squadron of F-22 Raptors to Guyana, a move that was officially described as routine training, but was clearly intended as a show of force. Now, let's talk about what this means in military terms. The George Washington is a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, one of the most powerful warships in the world. It carries more than 60 aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeye early warning planes.
In a conflict, it could launch airstrikes against Venezuelan targets within minutes. But here's the George Washington isn't invincible.
In fact, it's highly vulnerable to modern anti-ship missiles, and Venezuela has plenty of those.
Remember those Club S cruise missiles I mentioned earlier? The ones carried by the Sabalo?
They're designed to sink aircraft carriers. And Venezuela has at least 12 of them, courtesy of Russia.
In a real conflict, the Sabalo could lurk off the coast, waiting for the George Washington to come within range.
And if it fired, the US would have minutes, maybe less, to detect and intercept the missiles before they hit.
This isn't hypothetical.
In 2022, the Russian Navy conducted exercises in the Caribbean where it simulated an attack on a U.S. carrier strike group.
The message was, we can reach you.
And now, with Venezuela's submarines in the mix, the U.S. has to take that threat seriously. But the risks don't stop there. If the U.S. had decided to escalate, say, by sinking the Sabalo or striking Venezuelan military targets, Russia would have had to respond.
And that's where things get really dangerous. Russia has a mutual defense agreement with Venezuela, signed in 2001.
It's not as ironclad as NATO's Article 5, but it's still a commitment. And in 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela as a show of support. If the US had attacked Venezuelan forces, Russia could have responded by deploying more assets to the region, or worse, by escalating in Ukraine. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps military planners up at a local conflict spiraling into a global one. And it's not just theoretical. We've seen it before. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis nearly led to nuclear war over Soviet missiles in Cuba. In 1983, a NATO exercise called Able Archer was so realistic that the Soviet Union prepared for a first strike. And in 2018, the US and Russia came dangerously close to direct conflict in Syria after a US airstrike killed Russian mercenaries. The Sabalo incident was different in scale, but not in kind. It was a reminder that in the age of great power competition, even small conflicts can have global consequences. And that brings us to the domestic political dimension, because in Washington, foreign policy isn't just about strategy.
It's also about politics. The domestic why the US can't afford to back down. Here's something you won't hear in the mainstream: the Sabalo incident happened at the worst possible time for the Biden administration. Let's rewind to early 2024. The war in Ukraine is dragging on, with no end in sight. The US is pouring billions into Kyiv, but public support is waning. The Middle East is on fire after the Israel-Hamas war, and the US is being pulled in multiple directions. Inflation is still a problem, the border crisis is dominating headlines, and the 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on Biden's leadership. In other words, the administration is under immense pressure. And in that environment, appearing weak on foreign policy is political kryptonite. Now, consider the optics of the Sabalo incident. Venezuela, a country the US has been trying to isolate for years, just used a Russian-made submarine to challenge American power in the Western Hemisphere. If Biden had done nothing, he would have been accused of appeasement, of allowing Russia and China to extend their influence right under America's nose. But if he had escalated, say, by authorizing a strike on the Sabalo, he would have risked a direct confrontation with Russia. And in an election year, that's a gamble no president can afford. So what did he do? He split the difference. The George Washington was sent to the region, but no shots were fired. The US issued a stern warning, but no ultimatum. It was classic crisis: show strength, but don't overcommit. But here's the: in the age of great power competition, splitting the difference is no longer an option. The US can't afford to look weak, but it also can't afford to overreach. And that's a recipe for miscalculation. Let me tell you something I've learned from decades of studying: these crises don't happen because leaders want them. They happen because leaders misjudge their adversaries. In 1914, no one wanted World War I. But a series of miscalculations, Germany's belief that Britain wouldn't intervene, Russia's belief that Austria-Hungary would back down, led to catastrophe. In 1962, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted nuclear war. But a series of missteps, US missiles in Turkey, Soviet missiles in Cuba, nearly ended the world. And in 2024, the Sabalo incident was we are one miscalculation away from disaster. So where do we go from here? What happens next? And how do we avoid sleepwalking into a conflict that no one wants? Scenario 3: Possible futures. Let's game this out. Based on the current trajectory, there are 3 possible scenarios for how this plays out, none of them particularly good. Scenario 1, the best case outcome: controlled escalation, diplomatic off-ramp. In this Scenario 1, the best case outcome: controlled escalation, diplomatic off-ramp. In this version of events, the US and Venezuela engage in a carefully choreographed dance of deterrence and de-escalation. The George Washington maintains its presence in the Caribbean, but at a safe distance, close enough to project power, far enough to avoid accidental collisions. The Biden administration, through back channels, makes it clear to Maduro that while the US won't tolerate another submarine provocation, it's also not looking for regime change. Not right now, anyway. The Venezuelans, for their part, quietly recall the Sabalo to port, claiming it was a routine training exercise all along. The Russians stay silent, the Chinese offer vague statements about regional stability, and the whole thing fades into the background noise of great power competition. Now, what most people don't realize is that this outcome isn't just possible, it's the most likely. Why? Because neither side actually wants a war. Maduro isn't suicidal, he's a survivor. He knows that if he pushes too hard, the US has 1,000 ways to make his life miserable, from cyber attacks to targeted sanctions on his inner circle. And Biden? He's got enough on his plate with Ukraine, Taiwan, and an election that's shaping up to be a referendum on his foreign policy. The last thing he needs is a new crisis in America's backyard.
But here's the uncomfortable: even if this scenario plays out, it's not a victory.
It's a delay.
Because the underlying tensions, the economic collapse of Venezuela, the Russian and Chinese inroads into Latin America, the erosion of U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere aren't going away. They're just being papered over with diplomatic niceties.
Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, assuming that its dominance in the region was permanent. But while Washington was distracted by the Middle East, Beijing was signing trade deals, Moscow was selling weapons, and Caracas was turning into a client state for both. The Cibalo incident wasn't an aberration, it was a symptom of a much larger shift. And if the US doesn't start treating Latin America as a strategic priority, we're going to see more of these close calls. Scenario 2, the middle ground, proxy war by other means. This is where things get messy.
In this scenario, the US doesn't launch a full-scale invasion of Venezuela, but it doesn't back down either.
Instead, it ramps up support for the opposition, tightens sanctions, and maybe even greenlights a covert operation to destabilize Maduro's regime.
The Venezuelans, in turn, double down on their alliance with Russia and China, inviting more military advisors, more arms shipments, and maybe even a permanent Russian naval presence in the Caribbean.
Now, you might be, that sounds a lot like the Cold War. And you'd be right.
Because that's exactly what this is, a 21st century version of the old superpower proxy wars, but with higher stakes.
The difference this time? The US isn't the only player with skin in the game.
China has a vested interest in keeping Venezuela afloat, not out of ideological solidarity, but because it's a key supplier of oil and a foothold in the Western Hemisphere.
And Russia?
Putin sees Venezuela as a way to bleed the US, to force Washington to divide its attention and resources.
Here's the thing about proxy: they have a way of spiraling out of control.
In the 1980s, the US backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets.
That worked out great, didn't it?
Fast forward to 2024, and the US is still dealing with the blowback from that decision.
If we start funneling weapons to Venezuelan opposition groups, how long before those weapons end up in the hands of cartels or other criminal networks? And if Russia starts sending more advanced anti-air systems to Venezuela, how long before one of those systems shoots down a US drone, or worse, a manned aircraft? Let me be, I'm not saying the US should do nothing.
But there's a fine line between deterrence and provocation, and right now, we're dancing dangerously close to that line.
The last thing we need is another forever war, this time in our own hemisphere.
Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome, direct confrontation.
This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. In this version of events, the Cibalo incident isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. Maybe the submarine doesn't surface when it's supposed to.
Maybe it gets too close to a US naval vessel and someone ICS. Maybe a miscommunication leads to a collision, or a warning shot that's interpreted as an act of war.
Whatever the trigger, the result is the rapid escalation that neither side can control. Now, you might be, that's ridiculous.
No one wants a war with Russia.
And you'd be right.
But that's the thing about crises, they don't always unfold the way leaders expect. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov prevented nuclear war by disobeying orders and refusing to launch a retaliatory strike after a false alarm. In 1995, the Russians nearly mistook a Norwegian scientific rocket for a US nuclear attack. And in 2018, a Syrian air defense missile nearly hit an Israeli F-16, prompting a massive Israeli retaliation. The point is, in the heat of the moment, rational actors don't always act rationally. And when you add in the fog of war, the pressure of an election year, and the egos of leaders who can't afford to look weak, the risk of miscalculation skyrockets.
Here's why this scenario is more plausible than you might think.
The US has been drawing red lines in Latin America for decades, and for the most part, those red lines have held. But every time an adversary crosses one and gets away with it, the next red line becomes a little fainter. In 2019, the US backed Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate leader, and Maduro didn't fall. In 2020, the US indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges, and he didn't flinch. In 2023, the US relaxed some sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions, and Maduro pocketed the concessions while keeping the sanctions relief.
So what happens when the next red line is crossed? What happens if the Sabalo isn't the last Russian submarine to operate in the Caribbean? What happens if China starts sending its own naval vessels to Venezuelan ports?
At some point, the US is going to have to decide whether it's willing to risk a direct confrontation to maintain its dominance in the region.
And if history is any guide, that decision won't be made by cool-headed strategists in a situation room. It'll be made by politicians under pressure, with incomplete information, and with the clock ticking.
Now, I'm not predicting World War III. But I am saying that the Sabalo incident was a wake-up call, and if we don't start paying attention, we're going to sleepwalk into a crisis that no one can control.
The question isn't whether the US can afford to ignore Venezuela.
The question is whether it can afford not to.
And right now, the answer isn't clear.
Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about submarines or red lines, it's about the slow-motion collapse of Venezuela's political system and how that collapse is being weaponized by both domestic and external actors. The Sabalo incident wasn't an isolated provocation, it was a symptom of a much deeper dysfunction, one that's been building for years and is now reaching a breaking point. And if we want to understand where this is headed, we need to look at the domestic chessboard first, because that's where the next crisis will likely begin. Let's start with the Nicolas Maduro is not in control of Venezuela in the way that most autocrats are. He's not a strongman like Putin or Xi, who can snap their fingers and expect absolute obedience. He's more like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff, with one hand gripping the ledge and the other swatting away the vultures circling above. The military, the ruling party, the business elites, the criminal gangs, all of them have their own agendas, and none of them are particularly loyal to Maduro beyond what he can offer them in the moment. That's why his government is so erratic, so unpredictable. It's not a unified regime, it's a coalition of factions held together by fear, corruption, and the shared understanding that if the system collapses, they all go down with it. Take the military, for example.
The Venezuelan armed forces are not the disciplined, ideologically driven force they were in the early days of Chavismo.
They're a fractured institution, riddled with corruption and infighting. The top brass, men like Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez and the head of the Strategic Operational Command, Domingo Hernandez Larez, are more concerned with protecting their own financial interests than with any grand revolutionary project.
The lower ranks? Many of them are starving. A 2023 report by the Venezuelan NGO Control Ciudadano found that 60% of active duty soldiers earn less than $10 a month.
That's not a military, that's a powder keg. And it's not just the enlisted men who are restless. There have been at least 3 attempted coups since 2019, including the bizarre and poorly executed Operation Gideon in 2020, where a ragtag group of mercenaries, some of them former U.S. Special Forces, tried to infiltrate the country and capture Maduro. The fact that such a slapdash operation even got off the ground tells you everything you need to know about the regime's fragility. Then there's the ruling party itself, the PSUV.
It's not the monolithic force it once was.
The old guard, Chavez's inner circle, is either dead, in exile, or sidelined. What's left is a generation of apparatchiks who rose to power not through ideological conviction, but through patronage and survival. Diosdado Cabello, the party's number 2 and arguably the second most powerful man in Venezuela, is a perfect example. He's not a true believer in socialism, he's a pragmatist who understands that the only way to stay in power is to keep the money flowing. That's why he's been so vocal about courting foreign investment, even from countries like the US, which he once called the Empire of Evil. The PSUV is no longer a revolutionary party, it's a syndicate of elites who figured out how to profit from the country's collapse. And let's not forget the opposition, which is just as fractured as the regime it's trying to replace. The 2024 presidential election is shaping up to be a farce, but not in the way most people think. It's not that Maduro will steal the election, though he almost certainly will, but that the opposition can't even agree on whether to participate in the first place. The main opposition coalition, the Unitary Platform, is a mess of competing factions, each with its own strategy and its own foreign backers. Maria Corina Machado, the hardline anti-Chavista who won the opposition primary in 2023, is a polarizing figure even within her own camp. She's been banned from running, but her supporters are pushing for her to be the candidate anyway, which would almost certainly lead to a boycott by other opposition groups. Meanwhile, figures like Enrique Capriles, who's run for president twice before, are advocating for a more pragmatic approach, arguing that the opposition needs to participate in the election, even if it's rigged, to maintain some semblance of legitimacy. The problem is, neither side has a realistic plan for what happens after the election. Do they accept a fraudulent result and try to negotiate from a position of weakness? Do they call for mass protests, knowing full well that the regime will respond with violence? Or do they double down on international pressure, even though that strategy has failed for the past decade? Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela is no longer a country in the traditional sense. It's a failed state with a veneer of sovereignty, propped up by foreign actors who see it as a useful tool in their own geopolitical games. Russia and China aren't investing in Venezuela out of altruism, they're doing it because they see an opportunity to weaken U.S. influence in the region. Iran isn't sending oil tankers to Venezuela out of solidarity, it's doing it because it needs a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And the U.S. isn't sanctioning Venezuela out of principle, it's doing it because it can't afford to let a hostile regime control the world's largest oil reserves. The tragedy is that none of these actors actually care about the Venezuelan people. They care about the resources, the strategic position, the leverage. And the longer this goes on, the more Venezuela becomes a pawn in a much larger game, one that could easily spiral out of control. So where does this leave us? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, none of them particularly optimistic. The first is what I call the managed decline scenario. In this version of events, Maduro survives the 2024 election either by stealing it outright or by convincing enough of the opposition to participate in a sham vote, and the international community, exhausted by years of failed interventions, gradually accepts his rule as a fait accompli. The U.S. relaxes sanctions further in exchange for minor concessions, like the release of political prisoners or the return of some exiled opposition figures. Russia and China continue to prop up the regime with loans and investments, but the economy remains stagnant, and the country's infrastructure continues to crumble. Venezuela becomes a permanent fixture on the global stage, a failed state that no one can fix, but no one can ignore. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most dangerous, because it normalizes the idea that great powers can carve out spheres of influence in the Western Hemisphere without consequences. If Venezuela gets away with hosting Russian submarines and Chinese military advisors, what's to stop Cuba from doing the same? Or Nicaragua? Or Bolivia? The U.S. would never tolerate a Russian naval base in Mexico, but if it accepts one in Venezuela, it's effectively ceding the Caribbean to Moscow and Beijing. The second scenario is the Sudan option. In this version, the regime collapses not because of external pressure, but because of internal fractures. The military, tired of being used as Maduro's personal enforcers, stages a coup. Or perhaps a faction within the PSUV, seeing the writing on the wall, decides to cut a deal with the opposition to avoid prosecution. This is what happened in Sudan in 2019, when the military ousted Omar al-Bashir after months of protests. The problem is, Venezuela doesn't have a strong civil society or a unified opposition that could step in and stabilize the country. What's more likely is a period of chaos, with different factions vying for control, foreign actors backing their preferred proxies, and the country descending into a low-intensity civil war. This is the scenario that keeps U.S. policymakers up at night, because it's the one most likely to trigger a direct intervention. If the U.S. believes that a collapse in Venezuela could lead to a refugee crisis on the scale of Syria, or if it fears that Russian or Iranian forces could gain a permanent foothold, it might decide that the only way to prevent disaster is to act preemptively. The third scenario is the Cuba 2.0 outcome. In this version, Maduro doubles down on repression, using the 2024 election as an excuse to crack down on dissent and consolidate power. The opposition is either co-opted or crushed, and Venezuela becomes a full-blown dictatorship, completely dependent on foreign patrons for survival. This is the path Cuba took in the 1960s, and it's the one that Maduro seems to be following. The difference is that Cuba was a small island with limited strategic value. Venezuela is a continental power with the world's largest oil reserves. A Cuban-style regime in Venezuela would be a nightmare for the U.S., not just because of the ideological threat, but because of the sheer scale of the problem. It would mean a permanent Russian and Chinese presence in the Caribbean, a constant stream of refugees, and the very real possibility of a proxy war fought on America's doorstep. None of these scenarios end well for Venezuela. But here's the they don't have to end well for the US either. The Cibalo incident was a warning shot, a reminder that the rules of the game have changed.
The US can no longer assume that its dominance in the Western Hemisphere is a given.
It can no longer afford to treat Venezuela as a secondary issue, something to be dealt with after more pressing threats like China or Russia. Because the truth is, Venezuela is the front line in a much larger struggle. If the US loses influence there, it loses influence everywhere. And if it doesn't act now, it may not get another chance.